Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Research Methods, ITMM 315, and we're on to Unit 2. It was good to see everybody's involvement in the discussion questions, and it's great to get various discussion going back and forth. And remember, if you can, also comment or read through some of the other comments that people have made, and feel free to, discuss, question, everything like that, things that other people have written as well. As I noted in the sort of video introduction for this unit, this chapter of your text, this chapter of this course, this part of the course, is a little bit more complex, a little bit more involved. So it may take a little bit more time. You may have some more questions or uh, greater questions for this unit. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask, um, or even just do a little bit of searching yourself. Check through on Google and Wikipedia and other sources of information. Um, you can even find some things on this sort of stuff through YouTube that will help you to better understand and provide concrete examples. But I'll try to do my best to kind of walk you through all of these different terms and ideas and everything, and really concentrate on what's most important about this unit and its information. So, as always, don't hesitate to ask. If you have any questions, send me a quick message, send me a quick email. I can even go online and chat with any of you at any time, either through the Collaborate Ultra link on the Moodle shell or various other things like WebEx, Skype, WhatsApp, FaceTime, whatever the case may be. All right, so rolling into things, we're going to talk this week about, again, a few for things in the news. Then we'll go through what your text refers to as the poem of research, or paradigms, ontologies, epistemologies, and methodologies for research. Then we'll get a little bit deeper or a little more discussion about the difference between primary and secondary research and data, and a few pros and cons about secondary data. One of the key things that came up in the news this week, especially anyone here in British Columbia, is that um, the provincial government this week announced a $100 million level of support in their budget for the Tourism Industry Association of British Columbia, or for tourism and hospitality here in BC. Now, originally, the industry association had asked for almost 700 million. So the 100 million is quite a bit lower than was originally hoped. Although, as is the reality, quite often in politics, quite often in government and that sort of thing, groups will ask for more information, for more money, and knowing that it's going to be a bit of a negotiation between what the government wants to give and what their bare minimum versus what they'd like to have. So a few highlights from this budget: $50 million allocated to a tourism task force. And what's kind of really neat for us at in the school is that several of the people on the tourism task force, we have connections to. So we'll be able to find out directly from them what's going on with the task force. And in fact, one of the people, Rod Harris, who is a former head of Tourism BC, is actually one of our instructors for finance. So hopefully he'll be available to teach in the January and in the winter term depending upon how busy this tourism task force is. So you can see some of the other highlights, 19 million for small municipalities, 14 million for targeted tourism development initiatives, and about 20 million for infrastructure projects. So quite a variety, their product. So text talks about the research poem, which is again paradigm, ontology, epistemology, and methodology. Well, two important things to remember about with this information. One is that because this course does not have a test, we're not going to be testing you on any of this sort of stuff. You don't need to memorize all of the information. It's more important that you just kind of understand what's going on, understand the kind of how this sort of information affects and can affect the research that you do. So, and we'll go through each of these individually just to give you and try to give you some examples of each of them. To begin with, paradigms. Paradigms are kind of, they describe your basic beliefs, your overall view towards the world, towards different elements of existence, things like that. And they can really affect the way that you look at things. Now, you'll hear quite often, or you'll hear, when you're listening to the news and that, talk about paradigm shifts. And sometimes that phrase is overdone, overused. But to just give you a sense of what this means and how it can affect things, I'll just give you some kind of classic examples of paradigm shifts. And probably one of the first, maybe most famous, or one of the more famous paradigm shifts was, and this is kind of a very important perspective, is when things shifted completely, way, way back about whether or not the Earth revolved around the sun or the sun revolved around the Earth. And, originally there was this thought that the sun was revolving around the Earth until it was, I guess, discovered that it was actually the Earth revolving around the sun. That completely shifted the role and the perspective that people had regarding Earth and its kind of place in the universe. And in fact, at that time, there was no concept of even the universe. Another, important shift or important paradigm was Darwin's theory of evolution and this idea of survival of the fittest, and that nature and animals and creatures evolved over time, depending upon those that survived, and that different specializations would occur within different species, creating new kind of branches of species. Again, completely different view of animals and life and things like that. Kind of shifting forward quite a bit. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the term Earthrise or the Big Blue Marble, but if you type, Earthrise or Big Blue Marble into the into Google, you'll discover you'll discover a an image of Earth rising from, these are pictures from the moon of Earth as this distant thing, black all around it, and this perspective of the world, and the fact that Earth was just this tiny little marble in a vast open space. That image is credited to have really pushed the environmental movement and getting people to think and realize that we had a finite world to work within. Um, Again, moving things up even more recently, perspectives on climate change and the realization, again, maybe not by everybody, but by most people, that humans can affect the world's climate and what sort of impact that has on um, the way things are done and the whole sustainability and environmental movements were really spurred by or are affected by that different paradigm shift or that realization that humans can affect on a global scale the Earth's climate. So all of these sorts of things, all these different paradigms or views will affect how you look at things and your perspective on the world. Now, your text talks about three main, and really focuses more on the first two, but three main views on the world, basically, or research: positivism, interpretivism, and post-positivism. Now, just as kind of maybe a little bit of a thing to show you how different perspectives can change your view on things, here's just something for you to think about. Taking a look at this image and really thinking about, okay, what is it? And if you take a moment, maybe get some ideas in your head what you're looking at there. View is corn nuts. Another example of, this looks like it could be some, alien landscape, something like that. When it's just a close-up view of an egg. And kind of this bizarre creature, red things growing out of it. In fact, that's your tongue. So now the reason why I talk about these sorts of things and the importance of perspective is that depending upon your point of view or your perspective, that can really affect how you view things. Now, where this really plays a role within tourism and hospitality, for example, when you're researching something, and again, we'll get a little bit deeper into this and positivism versus interpretivism, but it's important, depending upon your perspective, to understand how somebody views what you're investigating, especially if you are on the side of interpretivism, because if that's the sort of view that you have about the world, interpretivism, then you really need to know to understand how somebody views something. You really need to understand things from their perspective, from their point of view. For example, I know, reading comments from last week that many of you are interested in sustainability and the environment and things like that. Um, Years ago, I used to work with Parks Canada. And one of the important things with working with Parks Canada is watching how people interact with wildlife. And it was always interesting for me to be involved in these research projects where we would be talking to people about their views on wildlife and things like that. And it was always important to me to understand their perspectives, where they were coming from, because if we wanted to create any management, if we wanted to create any messaging to these people, we had to know why they were doing what they were doing from their point of view. For example, in the national parks, there's a real issue with people getting too close to wildlife. But when you start to talk to people and you understand their point of view, you start to better realize why they're doing what they're doing. And for some of the people, especially those that have come from a far distance, we would get the response, well, I've just traveled, over 2,000 miles, thousands of miles. I've spent thousands of dollars to get here. I want to see that wild animal. I need to be close to that wild animal. That's why I came here. So others didn't recognize the danger. If they had never experienced wild animals before, um, they might view some of the different wild animals like deer and elk and moose and that um, from a very passive and, almost a domestic point of view, that these were just tame creatures and they could get close to them. They didn't understand the danger that was being posed by those wild animals. So once we started understanding why they were doing what they were doing, we were better able to create messaging that would address some of those views. So that comes from that more interpretivism perspective where you need to understand things from that person's point of view. The positivism point of view is that things like there's certain things out there that are just universal, that it's um, a perspective, a point of view. There's things out there, and not necessarily social things, but there's certain things out there that are always that way. Doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, anything like that. A fact is a fact. That's that sort of positivism point of view. And if you're trying to do research from that positivism perspective, then you're trying to find that universal truth. What is the one answer? I'm not going to go deep into this chart here, but you'll be able to see when the slides, if you look through the slides, when you look at them, the PDF, you'll be able to look a little bit deeper into some of these different aspects. That sort of emic versus etic, or the that qualitative positivism versus interpretivism, and that point of view. Very quickly, though, some criticisms of the different perspectives. If people that don't agree with that interpretivist point of view, interpretivist perspective, they suggest that interpretivism is not scientific because it's not objective. There's no real truth. So how can you create any rules? How can you if everything is based on a person's point of view, then there's nothing universal. There's no general knowledge that's developed. On the other side of it, people that criticize that positivist point of view or that positivist perspective, you look at reality and you say, well, my reality is not the same as your reality, so how can we have a universal truth? My view on the world, my view towards whatever is really based upon my past, my history, my upbringing, things like that. So that's why we need to, things need to be interpreted from that person's point of view. And you can't really quantify everything. How can you quantify a feeling? How can you quantify a perspective? That's the criticism of a positive point of view. So, a few other perspectives, a few other things that are mentioned, a few other paradigms. The post-positivist, that's kind of a cross between the positivist and the interpretivist. Constructivism, and you generate, instead of kind of singular points of view, you create multiple views. And then emancipatory theories, which actually isn't in your text, tries to create perspectives or views on the world based on minorities. So looking at different groups of minorities and trying to better understand the world from their perspective. That's where you have emancipatory theories. So to help you through kind of the rest of this poem of research methods, or research methodology, I'll just show you this to begin with, this diagram to begin with, this depiction, and then we'll actually come back to it after we go through some of the different topics. But you can see, going through some of the other terms that are in this unit, ontology kind of being the roots of the research, the roots of the theories and ideas, and ontology is how we view the world, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Epistemology, how we should investigate the world, kind of the trunk, or what's kind of holding everything up. Then you have methodology, is how we should collect the information, which is different from methods, which is the actual details of how we're going to collect the information, collecting the data. And there's a bit of a distinction there. I'm not going to go too deep into that, but methodology is the study of the collection of information, whereas methods is the actual collection, or the methods, or the techniques that we're using to actually collect the data. So we'll get into that a little bit further. So ontology. Ontology is it's really the study of existence and how we determine whether things exist or not. Quite often you'll use ontologies to group different things together based upon certain characteristics. And the reason why this becomes important is to help with the vocabulary or the terms used within that study or that research. So, as an example, we might be doing research and we want to group all of our respondents or all of our people based on culture. So that's the ontology or the basis or the root that we're going to use to group all of our responses, all of our ideas are based upon, in that case, based upon culture. Or maybe you want to base it upon gender or maybe, origins. Whatever the case may be, those sort of roots or ideas of how you're grouping everything together can affect how you describe your research and your views or your perspectives. Epistemology is kind of understanding how you're looking at or how you're studying the knowledge and how you're going to achieve that understanding of the knowledge. So, looking more at the kind of basis behind, as it kind of showed that the tree trunk and how you're going to look into your topic of research. That's where you get into that epistemology. Again, methodology, that's the type of research techniques that you should be using to better understand your topic, your ideas. Things like primary and secondary research, primary and secondary data, quantitative versus qualitative, things like that. And your text also talks about inductive versus deductive. So coming back to this diagram, ontology, that sort of basis of how are the roots of the research that we're doing. Epistemology being the trunk based on the roots or based on the ontology, and really linking together the how we view the world with how we best collect the data, which is the research methodology. So again, I just want to emphasize all of these sorts of things are really just to give you a better understanding of different perspectives or views or ways of understanding how we view the world, how we collect the data, how we interpret the data. So, and also just wanted to emphasize, you will not be tested on this. I'm not going to be asking you for definitions or anything like this. The main thing I want you to do is when you're conducting your research, for you to really understand your own point of view, your own perspective, because how you view the world will also affect how you collect the data, the things that you feel are important to be looking at, everything like that. So, and as always, if you have any questions, please contact myself and or Dr. Brian White, and we can kind of walk you through this as well. Text talks about inductive and deductive approaches. And really, if you think about induction and deduction, one way of looking at induction versus deduction, induction kind of looking backwards through the process, deduction looking forward with the understanding, and we'll talk about this more in a moment, that it's really a very circular process. Um, I would be more kind of inclined, or I'd probably call this more, I'd be more in that sort of circular process group, thinking about research, thinking about how we understand, how we look at the world, how we figure things out. In my mind, is more of a circular process than a linear process, because for the most part, we understand things uh, as we're going through the world. We better understand things kind of in a circular process. Take a few steps forward, a few steps back. Um, we better understand some element, some idea, and that creates some ideas and theories about how other things work. And with knowledge, we have a better understanding, and we can look backwards and forwards and figure things out. The more knowledge that we get about different ideas, different topics, things like that. So, and I'll kind of give you some better examples or take you through this in just a moment. In your text, figure 2.3 and 2.4 have actually, those are fairly good diagrams of that sort of inductive reasoning versus deductive reasoning. When you're thinking about inductive reasoning, really what's happening is you've noticed something. You've been watching, you've been looking, um, and because you've been watching or noticing things going on, maybe you start to notice a bit of a pattern of, of different behaviors, different actions, different ideas. And based on those patterns, you create a theory of a situation, a theory of an idea. That would be considered inductive reasoning. With deductive reasoning, you start with a theory about the way things work, and then you kind of test it out. You look for examples, you look for ideas, you take a look at whatever you were studying, and you try to see whether or not that theory actually works, whether it actually applies, or whether there's issues with that theory, and that theory either gets confirmed or it gets denied. Um, and that happens all the time, where you'll test out a theory and maybe you'll find out that that theory you had actually didn't work. That theory isn't valid, or maybe it's only valid in certain situations. So this sort of difference between inductive and deductive is important to think about where you're starting from and where you're hoping to be. Years ago, I was doing some research at the ice fields in Banff and Jasper, right? Actually, um, there's an ice fields parkway, and the glacier house, where you can take walks and you can actually take a bus up onto the glacier. Um, Kind of tragically, that's also where fairly recently there was one of those glacier buses that rolled over, and some people were badly injured and some were killed. So, but we were there doing some research to find out why people were not stopping at the signage, why people would go beyond the barriers and out onto the actual glacier. And occasionally, they'd fall into the crevices and either be injured or worse. So my role was to find out, what's going on and how can we stop that from happening. I had no theories, no ideas, nothing to work from. So the research that I was doing was going to be inductive reasoning, was going to be inductive research because I wasn't starting with any basic theory or idea. I had to just watch what was going on and then create a theory or a concept or an idea based upon my observations. And what we discovered was that, again, and this depending upon which group you're talking about, but for one thing, people would not stop at any signs because we had them spaced all the way up this path to get up to the top, to get up to the glacier. And people were in such a rush to get up to the glacier that they would not look at any of the signs on their way up. We did discover, though, that there was one flat point on the trail up where people would stop to rest. And we realized at that point that that was a perfect spot for us to put signage because we knew while they were resting, they would read some of the signs. And in fact, we put some benches there so that they could sit and read the signage and get some of the information that we wanted. The other thing we discovered was people really wanted to go onto the glacier, but we did not give them a way to do it safely. So because we didn't give them a way to do it safely, we didn't give them the knowledge or the understanding of some of the dangers, they would just do it all on their own. So what we started to do there was we actually had a roped off area where we would check out and make sure that it was safe for them to go onto the glacier in that particular area. And we found that the number of people just randomly walking off onto the glacier decreased dramatically because we suddenly had given them a way to get the experience that they wanted, but to do it in a safe and controlled manner. So that was an example of inductive reasoning. Some of the deductive reasoning, again, looking at some of the different places that I've done research, working with film-induced tourism and understanding based on previous research how film can affect people's views or perspectives on different destinations. Because there was some previous research for me to work from, I already had a theory or some ideas to test out. I created some hypotheses, and then I did some experiments to discover just exactly how film can affect people's perspectives or people's views on the world. So there's an example of inductive versus deductive reasoning. As your text talks about, though, and as I was mentioning earlier, it's really kind of a circular process that it's difficult to say where the actual starting and ending point is because you may start with observations which lead to a theory and understanding which drive you want to test that theory or those hypotheses out by doing more observation, and it just keeps going around and around as you gain more and more knowledge about a situation. So it's difficult sometimes to say exactly where the ideas or where the research began and where it ends. So now, primary versus secondary data. I'm sure all of you have heard of the difference or heard of primary and secondary data, although it can sometimes be confused or confusing for some people. primary data, secondary data. Primary data. Primary data is any information, any data that is collected specifically to answer a problem. If you are gathering primary data, then you are the one actually conducting the research. You are the person who is making the observations or asking the questions. You're the person writing down the answers, getting the numbers, whatever the case may be. You're the one driving that research. That's primary data. Secondary data, secondary research is information that's already out there. Somebody else has done the research, somebody else has gathered the information, has already compiled all the data, and you're just making use of that existing data. That's the big difference. So some examples, there might be internal and external sources of secondary data. Internal sources you might see as annual reports, reports to stockholders, product testing results, turnover, lots of different things, lots of internal sources for secondary data, lots of external sources as well, especially different levels of political or of government, federal, state, provincial, local, whatever the case may be, organizations, business periodicals, journal articles, things like that. Quite often you can find all of those external sources of information on the internet. Internal sources you might be able to find on the internet, but you may have to rely on somebody else, kind of a contact or that sort of thing, in order to give you the information. One other thing to mention at this point when we're talking about secondary data is something called gray literature. And I think you would have talked about gray literature in your 305 course, your the IHMM 305. But gray literature is kind of those sort of informal sources of information, data sources, things like that, that have not been checked over by what's called peer review, or basically where you've got somebody else making sure, kind of an external expert, making sure that that information is correct. That's where you have that sort of gray literature, and you can use gray literature in research. You just have to be careful how you use it, and you really have to understand who is creating that information and any of the biases or any of the perspectives that they might have that can affect the information. Quick example of that. Years ago, there was lots of research that was done that actually said smoking is not harmful to you. There was research that was published, and in fact, there was published information in journal articles and that sort of thing that said, no, smoking doesn't harm your health. Smoking's just fine. It wasn't until afterwards, when things got looked at a little bit deeper, when people discovered that the people that were doing the research, the people that were funding that research, were biased, and it was being paid for by your tobacco companies. So that's where you really have to be careful who the source of that information, what's what's driving them, and who's paying for the research. Very quickly, some advantages for secondary data. It can really help you better understand your problem, especially when you're just trying to figure out what research needs to be done. It may, depending upon what that research is, it may give you all the answers that you need at little or no cost. And if that's the case, then great. You can get the answers that you need for your problem. The data is already there, or the information is already there, and you can move on. Sometimes it may give you an alternative, another option versus actually conducting the research on your own. And that can be important. Sometimes it can be important if you can't get access in to conduct the research yourself. Maybe you don't have the money, you don't have the time, whatever the case may be. So it's just another way of gathering that information. It can provide you with some things to watch out for. If you're reading through some secondary research or some secondary data, and you find out that some of your views, some of the things you were going to look at, somebody already tried to look at that and it didn't work. The methods that they used, it didn't work. The group that they talked to, maybe it was the wrong group, whatever the case may be. So that secondary research can really help save you time and money so that you don't take the wrong path. And it also really provides a good background or a basis for the research that you're going to conduct, especially if you can find somebody else who's done research in a similar area, and maybe they've got results that are very similar to yours. So that really helps to provide credibility or weight to the information that you're gather. Some disadvantages though, secondary data isn't all great, not always available. Maybe nobody has looked at that, or maybe there's research on something, you just don't have access to it. This can be especially the case if you're dealing with maybe a private company, a proprietary bit of product or service, or whatever the case may be. Lots of situations, or maybe, no one's ever thought about something like that before. It may not be completely relevant. The research that's out there may not be quite on the topic that you're looking for. So maybe they looked at something in summertime, but you need to look at it during the winter, or vice versa. So that lack of relevance can be an issue. Maybe it doesn't go specific enough. It's not quite what you need, so you need to dig a bit deeper. Or what's especially true right now, things have changed. Something fundamental has changed. For example, like COVID. COVID and the crisis and everything like that has fundamentally shifted the views that we have about tourism and hospitality. So that right there can make secondary data, secondary research, not useful to you, or not as useful to you anymore. So those are all critical things to think about before you use secondary data. Lots of possible sources, and I'm not going to go through all of these different things, but check out Royal Roads' library, lots of information there. Google Scholar is a great source of information and a great source of research, and then various other sources across the internet. Your text also lists some things, and the Moodle shell lists various sources of secondary information that are useful. One final topic to just briefly mention is a thing called triangulation. And it's an important topic to consider within research, because what triangulation does is helps to verify that the findings that you're getting are valid, that it's not just a one-shot deal. It's not just a result based upon one point of view. What triangulation does is tries to view a problem, an issue, whatever thing that you're researching from 3 different perspectives. So one of those perspectives quite often is prior research or secondary research. So, you'll take a look at a topic and find out what research has already been done on it, and that gives you a bit of a basis. That gives you one of your 3 sides for triangulation. The next 2, though, are based upon your own research. It will be your own primary research. And so maybe you do a bit of quantitative research and a bit of qualitative research. Maybe you'll do some observations and some surveys. Maybe you'll do some interviews and some observations. All 3 of those different methods of looking at your research problem should hopefully come together and just give you a really good supported view of your problem. So that's what triangulation. Now, not all research is triangulated. A lot of industry research may not use triangulation. When I was doing research on visitors coming to Canada with Destination Canada or the Canadian Tourism Commission, we weren't doing triangulation. We might have had 2 of those points, so I might have looked at prior research or looked at somebody else's work, and then we would conduct some of our own research, but I didn't have that 3rd point of view. But for really good, solid, supported scientific research, generally you need to have all 3 points or all 3 perspectives. So, discussion questions for this week. What are some key sources of secondary information that you've discovered that were useful, and why were they useful? How are they useful? This is the sort of thing that's great to share amongst all of you, so that, rather than everyone having to discover their own great sources of information, you find some good sources of information and you share it with everyone else in the class. On the flip side of that is sources of information that you found were actually not very useful. Maybe they weren't very scientific. Maybe they didn't take a look at enough people. Maybe it wasn't detailed enough, or it's no longer valid. Whatever the case may be, again, it's great for you to share sources of information that worked and did not work with everyone else, so that as you, not only for this class and not only for this program, but throughout your professional career, what are those sources of information that you can rely on, and what are the ones that you absolutely cannot rely on? As a very quick example, one of the sources of information that used to be used a fair amount. When I was back with the Canadian Tourism Commission, we realized that a lot of it was being paid for by industry. So therefore, all of the results were very biased for the industry. So we were finding that any of the data from it, any of the results that they discovered were not very useful because we just couldn't trust it. So, and I'm not going to say who that organization is because they've actually improved from that time to now to become a little bit more reliable. But in the past, we had to discount everything that we got from that organization because we knew we couldn't use it. So again, important to share that sort of information amongst all of you so that you can make the best choices of information. Anyways, be great to see you online answering those questions, and have a terrific day, and thank you for listening. Take care. Bye.